The Cold War, a war from 1945 to 1991. This is U.S. History 10, Video 2.1. If we go back to the beginning, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had brought victory in World War II. Wartime cooperation meant glossing over many serious differences between the two. Since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Soviet leaders had been claiming that communism and capitalism could never peacefully coexist. But beginning in the 1930s, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, had tried to reach some sort of understanding with the West, that would be America, but only because he viewed Nazi Germany as the greater threat. After concluding that the West, America and the United Kingdom, was not interested in working with him, he made his own agreement with Hitler in 1939. The Russians entered the war on Hitler's side. But that agreement, of course, was quickly forgotten after Germany decided to secretly invade the Soviet Union in early 1941. After the United States entered the war in early 1941, the administration began encouraging Americans to view the Soviet Union not as a threat, but rather as a partner both for victory over the Axis, that would be the Nazis and the Japanese, and for maintaining peace in the post-war world. In newspaper and magazine articles, speeches, Hollywood films, etc., Americans were told again and again that although the Russian people had a different economic system, they were equally committed to democratic values and to a peaceful, stable world order. This message was hammered home throughout the war, but it meant that Americans would be in for a very rude awakening after the war was over. Agreements regarding the post-war world were reached at certain conferences, but the Soviets wasted no time in violating those orders. At the end of the war, this map depicts the situation in Europe around the time of VE Day, so that's Victory in Europe Day. The Soviet troops are in red. They were able to secure Eastern Europe, so they were able to free Poland from the Nazis, along with Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, and Yugoslavia. The Allies, that would be the United States, were able to secure Western Europe, obviously with the exception of Switzerland, and so that pitted the troops against one another to begin with. During the war, the U.S.S.R. was very upset that the Allies waited so long to invade France. France wasn't invaded until June of 1944, when D-Day began. The U.S.S.R. also lost 20 million lives, so they had a significant population dent, and they wanted to reclaim some of that population. The U.S.S.R. very much then focused on the East, which many of the Eastern countries, like Poland and Hungary, had already established communist governments. And we'll talk about in class that communism and capitalism are directly opposite of one another. With the USS focused on the West and the USSR focused on the East, the U.S. decided to end the Lend-Lease program early. That did not allow the USSR to gain all the weapons, ammunition, and other supplies that they badly needed in losing 20 million lives and a lot of their infrastructure. All these things get back to the point that the USSR and the United States had very different values. Capitalism and communism are typically opposites of one another, and although during the war Americans were pushed very hard to accept their Soviet allies, things would change very quickly at the end of the war. Once war is over, Germany surrendered in April 1945. Japan would not surrender again till August. Soldiers began returning from war back to the United States, back to their jobs, back to new jobs, and they returned, and of course we saw the greatest baby boom in our country's history, with thousands and thousands of children born in a very short period of time in the late 1940s. Americans fled to the suburbs. They built those new little box houses that all looked the same. Everyone drove the big fancy car, and pop culture, that's rock and roll, the beat poets, etc., raged in the country. So with that context of what's happening in the country, some things in Europe were making it difficult for the U.S. to remain allies with the USSR. To top it off, the longest-serving president in American history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, died in April of 1945. In April of 1945, with his death, also marked the passing of a solid relationship with the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. They had a very close personal working relationship, and therefore, when Roosevelt's vice president, Harry Truman, took over the White House, serious problems developed. not because Harry Truman was necessarily bad at diplomacy, however, that personal relationship was gone. So this would lead to the former allies clashing. On the American side, or the Sylvester Stallone Rocky side, if you will, you've seen Rocky IV, where he fights the Russian, we have the capitalists. The capitalists are Americans, and the capitalists believe that an economy should be controlled privately and that a leader should be elected by the people, and we should function by competition. So this is the lowest possible price and the best possible product drives success. Whereas on the opposite side, the Soviet side, or the Drago side if you're a Rocky fan, we have the communists. Communists believe that the state or the country should control all property and the economy, which leads them to have a totalitarian government with no free elections. There's no competition, but there is equality, so you don't have that huge gap between rich and poor as we have in the United States. These fundamental differences, which occurred at the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, would lead the United States and the U.S.S.R. to part ways and no longer be allies. Furthermore, the United States and U.S.S.R. had grown suspicious of one another during World War II. The creation of the atomic bomb by the Americans was kept secret from all of their allies, including the U.S.S.R. The U.S.S.R. later developed that technology, which would lead the United States to suspicions that they weren't sharing other secrets. With the end of the war, at present, the United States, the U.S.S.R., and the United Kingdom, the Big Three, decided to meet at Yalta to have a conference about the fate of the post-war Europe world. This occurred in February 1945, so shortly before Hitler would surrender in April of 1945. At the Yalta Conference, the USSR, the UK, and the United States, again the Big Three, would discuss some very specific things in reference to the fate of post-war Europe. They would settle some significant post-war challenges. For instance, they all agreed that there would be free elections in Poland, which had become communist during the war after it was liberated by the USSR, but the United States wanted to ensure that there would be free elections to make sure that that was what the people wanted. The USSR wanted some serious reparations or repayment from Germany for all the damage they had done during the war. Additionally, the Big Three agreed to divide Germany into 4 specific zones, one belonging to the UK, one belonging to the US, the USSR, and finally one belonging to France, making it 4 equal zones. It furthermore established the United Nations, which would be an international body of governments which would help keep peace in the world in order to ensure that World War III would not occur just a short time later. The United Nations, the seal located here, is an international law-making body that includes nations from around the world. It's currently made up of 51 nations, and it was established April 25, 1945, but the foundations of it were set at the Yalta Conference back in February of 1945. It became an arena where the USSR and the United States would clash as they were both members with veto power. The UN is still around today, and it has many more nations than just the 51 who established. Just a few months after the end of the war, Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, again the Big Three, decided to meet again at Potsdam, which is an area in Germany right outside Berlin. They did so in July of 1945. They discussed the demilitarization of Germany, that is, taking away the industrial complex that served the German war machine. It would further divide not only Germany but Austria into 4 zones to ensure that the Germans could not take over Austria and recreate the German state. This additionally called for the denazification of Germany, or the imprisonment of many Nazis who committed war crimes during the war. It also divided the capitals of Vienna and Berlin into 4 specific zones, each one belonging to one of the Big Three, including and added France. The USSR would then also commit to joining the Pacific War soon. It was July 1945, and the Pacific War was still raging, with the United States just recently fighting Iwo Jima and Okinawa battles. Remember that this video is about the breakdown of relations between the United States and its former ally, the USSR. If you remember, the USSR did lose 20 million people in World War II. The Battle of Stalingrad was extremely challenging for them. They lost a number of civilians in addition to soldiers, but including that, there was mass starvation all over their country in addition to the soldiers whose lives were sacrificed for the winning of the war. The USSR therefore sought to increase their population by developing and supporting what we call satellite nations. Their goal was to gain population and protection, create a buffer zone between them and the Germans to prevent future wars and future invasions. The Soviets were very good at installing communist governments called satellite nations along their perimeter. Those satellite nations included areas like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, etc. After the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, it was very clear that Stalin was not living up to his side of the agreements that the US, the UK, and the USSR were making. Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Poland very quickly became satellite nations of the USSR in the fact that they were controlled by communist totalitarian dictators who answered directly to Stalin. The Soviets claimed that these satellite nations were friendly regimes along their border and that the Western-style democratic elections were unlikely to produce pro-Soviet governments, and so therefore Stalin did not agree to the free elections in places like Poland. To Harry Truman, the current U.S. president, this seemed like a betrayal of everything that the Allies had fought for in their war against the Axis powers. Additionally, large numbers of Americans of Eastern European descent were inclined to agree with him. As a result of this, the high hopes that FDR had for post-war cooperation had largely been destroyed by 1946, prompting a debate over what U.S. policy toward the Soviets should be. This would mark the start of what we call the Cold War. The Cold War would last over 45 years. No direct shots would be fired between the United States and the USSR. Remember that by the late 1940s, both superpowers had use of the atomic bomb and long-range bombers that were capable of flying thousands of miles. However, there were millions of lives lost in this fight because there were a lot of satellite battles, such as Vietnam, Korea, etc., that were fought indirectly between these two superpowers, which led to billions and billions of dollars being spent. In looking at the Cold War, for the most half of the 20th century, the world is kind of divided into two places. We have the East controlled by the USSR, that's Russia and China and the Koreas, and parts of Eastern Europe. And it seems like the rest of the world, that's Western Europe, some parts of Northern Africa, and all of the Western Hemisphere, including parts of the Eastern Hemisphere like Japan, were controlled by the United States, or allied with the United States. In looking at this map, we see the breakdown of countries that would be allied with the USSR and the United States at the beginning of the Cold War in very early 1946.